I have noticed a reignition of discussion surrounding aerial bombardment, its effectiveness, and the results of air campaigns. With Russia apparently hitting multiple children's hospitals in their protracted air campaign in Ukraine, it's apparent the world isn't in a place where even world leaders have a good understanding of what they are doing.
You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of.
But you have heard of me.
At risk of just throwing another uninformed take on the flaming content dumpster fire that is the internet in 2024, I think a little clarity is needed on the situation. While I don't consider myself an expert, the amount of bad takes and comments from the peanut gallery I have to read about the performance of the Russian Air Force is enough to get me to make this video on its own. And with Elon Musk posting on Twitter that the US are morons for continuing to build the F-35, more than ever, some people without an agenda are needed in the media space. That being said, this topic looms large in the public eye. First and foremost because it's scary and exciting. Hell being rained down on you from above is a lot harder to see your nation prevailing against than any conventional forces. We've also been given stunning depictions of dogfights and air campaigns in the media ever since World War II. Additionally, the United States, the world's largest and most influential military, has bought into the strategy of massive air campaigns to win wars. Everywhere the US military goes, the air campaign is often the most wide-scale, as well as most controversial part of the operation. Drone strikes during the War on Terror, the carpet bombing of Vietnam, the leveling of almost every structure in North Korea, and the only nuclear strikes ever used in the history of war have all been conducted by the US military in the last 100 years. Surrounding all these campaigns, there is an almost endless discussion over whether or not they are ethical, whether or not the ends justify the means. I will not be touching that question. I will leave that up to the megamind philosophers. The same philosophers who have yet to come to a conclusion on whether any war is bad. After 2,000 years. I'm sure they'll have a conclusion for us soon. No, this is not another diatribe on ethics. Today, we'll be focused on whether or not these air campaigns actually work. First, a little background. There are some terms you will hear when it comes to airstrikes: strategic, tactical, and close air support. Put broadly, strategic bombing is against infrastructure and civilians, targeting the ability of the nation itself to wage war. Tactical bombing would be hitting targets that support ground forces and impede enemy forces. Close air support is directly supporting ground forces from the air. If your infantry calls for help against an enemy position, that's close air support. If you attack an airfield full of planes or an enemy vehicle convoy, that would be a tactical strike. If you hit an oil refinery supplying the army with fuel, that's strategic bombing. Although, these aren't exactly rigid definitions. One target can easily fall into different categories depending on the context. If you attack a bridge or railway, this could either be tactical or strategic, depending on why you are attacking it. Blowing a bridge to stop troop reinforcements from arriving during an offensive would be tactical. Doing it to disrupt the civilian economy would be strategic. Clear as mud? Good, moving on. Pretty much as soon as people began flying in balloons, and soon after fixed-wing aircraft, they came up with the bright idea of raining hell down upon people or structures you prefer were out of the picture. In 1906, 3 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, H.G. Wells released The War in the Air, a novel depicting a world war involving massive air campaigns. In this book, the countries of the world quickly realized the need for air dominance and subsequently engage in a massive arms buildup. An expansionist Germany challenges the USA over the Monroe Doctrine, and war ensues. This war proves traditional surface vessels to be obsolete due to their vulnerability to aerial attack. Like any science fiction book, some of the predictions look good, others do not. In reality, it took much longer for the value of air power to be fully realized. The Germans hold the honorable title of being the first people to drop explosives from the air during a military campaign. Quickly, the other powers saw the potential of this new way of war. One of the earliest and most vocal advocates for widespread use of air power was Giulio Douhet, an Italian general. Like every general in history, Giulio dreamt of a quick and easy end to the war. He saw the situation of Italy locked in a stalemate on the ground with Austria, as well as the similar situation on the Western Front. The Italian army had been ill-equipped and ill-prepared to fight, which prompted Giulio to think his way out of the situation. He proposed a force of 500 bombers for Italy to help win the First World War. He was repeatedly ignored. He continued to obsess about this to such an extent that he was eventually court-martialed and was imprisoned for a year for criticizing the Italian military. Then, this former soldier, bitter about his country's performance in World War I, wrote his memoir in prison. A memoir that contained ideas that went on to kill millions. No, not that one, the other one. Giulio wrote, Il Domino dell'Aria, the command of the air, which provided an initial roadmap for strategic bombing. Giulio foresaw a future where wars would last a matter of weeks, with each opposing army and navy fighting an inglorious holding campaign and their respective air forces dismantling the enemy's country. If one side did not rapidly surrender, both would be so weak within just the first few days that the war would effectively cease. The idea of strategic bombing quickly spread, and was especially appealing to the British. They had a vast empire and many potential enemies, but probably weren't going to face a conflict where their population would be tolerant of the terrible losses required from a ground campaign. During the interwar period, one Hugh Trenchard was the leading advocate for strategic bombing in the UK. He believed in the unique ability of a modern air force to win wars quickly by unaided strategic bombing. As the speed and altitude of bombers increased in proportion to fighter aircraft, the prevailing strategic understanding became, the bomber will always get through. Just like Giulio, Trenchard believed there was effectively no defense against strategic bombing. Limited air campaigns worked well for the UK in what is now Iraq and Yemen. They determined it was less costly to manage the colonies this way, and it gave strategic bombing some credibility. This continued to reinforce the idea that you could bomb a population into submission and win a war quickly without contest. These interwar planners were operating on some assumptions that would prove to be relatively, demonstrably, false. Number 1, there's effectively no defense against bombers. Number 2, hitting a target from a plane is easy. Number 3, civilians will force their government to capitulate if significantly affected by war.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
They also vastly overestimated the damage these bombs would do. The British in 1938 predicted that if a war with Germany broke out, 35% of British homes would be gone in just the first 3 weeks. In 1928, Duhay wrote that he believed 300 tons of bombs over the most important cities could end a war in less than a month. This type of expectation would justify the appeasement of Hitler in the late 1930s. These calculations were obviously not done by anyone resembling a competent mathematician. They assumed accuracy rates, destructive capabilities, as well as spread of munitions far, far too favorably for the attacker. The reality is dropping unguided bombs from a plane with poor or no targeting sights, flown by a pilot navigating on maps and targeting using line of sight, might not be the most accurate thing in the world. A standard 500-pound bomb will, on average, kill an unprotected person at a distance of 20 meters. That is really not that big of a radius for a munition dropped from a fucking plane. This is much, much smaller if the person is taking cover or is building fortifications, like people often do when they have bombs dropped on them. Additionally, you have the problem of bombs falling in more or less the same location. The net result is that the number of bombers and number of bombs needed to induce the kind of damage needed for capitulation was underestimated by orders of magnitude. Beyond that, Giulio, Trenchard, and others vastly underestimated the speed that people could repair the damage done by bombs, as well as the measures people could take to protect structures and build fortifications. While I don't expect people to be able to perfectly predict the future of war, there were some red flags as to what was to come. In the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, British psychologist E.B. Strauss surmised, Observers state that one of the most remarkable effects of the bombing of open towns in Spain has been the welding together into a formidable fighting force of groups or political factions who were previously at each other's throats. A sentiment which Hitler's Luftwaffe, who supported the Spanish nationalists, generally agreed with. Unfortunately, this was not a great period of enlightenment and rationality in Europe, and these lessons were not learned. This was a period of nationalism. Nationalism on the surface may only look like believing in the superiority of your nation or perhaps your way of government. The problem is in countries whose national identity is tied to ethnicity, as is the case in much of Europe, nationalism almost always leads to a superiority complex among its subscribers. This idea of populations capitulating was heavily attached to nationalism, the idea being, well, my particular nation is tough, manly, superior, and can clearly endure more punishment than anyone else's. As Trenchard put it, the French in a bombing duel would probably squeal before we did. When reading about this period, it seems clear to me that in their hearts, people knew that bombing civilians would probably just piss them off. But everyone was largely too racist to accept that other countries were the same as their own. I'll stop here and comment that this idea of total war in targeting civilians may seem severe to us in 2024. And yes, if you watch Nickelodeon, it is literally the Fire Lord's plan for final victory.
Prince Zuko, you've been among the Earth Kingdom commoners. Do you think that adding more troops will stop these rebellions?
The people of the Earth Kingdom are proud and strong. They can endure anything as long as they have hope.
Yes, you're right. We need to destroy their hope.
Well, that's not exactly what
I think you should take their precious hope and the rest of their land and burn it all to the ground.
Yes, you're right, Azula. From our airships, we will rain fire over their lands. A fire that will destroy everything.
However, a lot like in the show, ideas like this only come from men scarred from long, drawn-out conflicts. In the mind of the interwar planners, any way to shorten a war would be better than another World War I. Any American historians would observe that this is a similar sentiment to the reasons given to General Sherman on his Scorched Earth campaign during the US Civil War. With the extensive background knowledge I've given you on types of bombing, you're probably dying to ask, well, what did these interwar planners think about close air support? I would reply, this is pre-recorded, I can't hear you, but thank you, that is an excellent point. The first close air support missions were flown in World War I. The tactics and aircraft started off extremely crude, but the effect on morale and devastation the aircraft could inflict was clear from the get-go. Unfortunately for the pilots, the belligerents of World War I pretty quickly figured out ways to defend themselves against these attacks from the air, and the problem with close air support became very apparent. These air raids were costly, and coordinating with ground troops proved very difficult. The top brass at that time was not happy with the answer they got. They did not want a weapon, they wanted a miracle. The belief that several hundred bombers would be enough to win a war outright led to an almost complete abandonment of close air support aircraft and tactics going into World War II. Britain and the RAF were the most egregious example of this. The British Armed Forces had something of a power struggle forming between the Navy, the RAF, and the Army. The three branches were all competing for resources, and the Air Force was definitely not going to admit that they were only good for supporting the ground campaign. They wanted to be the most important, the top dog, the head honcho. Close air support missions were expensive and costly. Why risk it when you could just take the free win through strategic bombing? A similar power struggle took place in most of the other militaries in the world as well. Curiously, because they were limited in what they were allowed to build by the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were not able to build a fleet of heavy bombers in the interwar period unlike the other powers. This led them into putting a little more thought into how to use the bombers they did have. The Luftwaffe put a lot of emphasis into tactical bombing to disrupt convoys and communications, as well as close air support. This usage of tactical airstrikes, close air support, combined with artillery, tanks, and infantry would be dubbed Blitzkrieg by observers in the West. Now, before you accuse me, no, I am not a World War II Germany stan. I am not a Wehraboo, as they are called. But in this case, the Germans did seem to almost luck into having a more accurate idea of how to use their aircraft. Armed with this knowledge of German aircraft and tactics, you might surmise that the strategy of picking a fight with the one island nation in Europe that you are unable to launch a ground campaign against might not be the best move. Some might argue that that would force the Air Force to do something they did not train on in aircraft that were ill-equipped to do it. Having good tactics and logistics will not help you if you pick an impossible mission. So, when the war broke out, the Germans and the Brits tried to unleash these theories developed in the interwar period onto each other. The German tactics worked quite well in both the Eastern and Western Front. German air campaigns were often decisive and overwhelming, but losses were consistently high. The battle for France, which ended in a rout for the Germans, still saw losses of 1,500 aircraft. The Luftwaffe then turned into operating as the primary force to prepare a land invasion of the UK from the south. The Luftwaffe failed in this task, taking heavy losses. Not knowing what to do, they then pivoted to a strategy of strategic bombing of UK civilians. This campaign infamously did nothing but piss the British off. In fact, it's hard for me to think of a people who were more against capitulation than the British during the Second World War. These repeated attacks on Britain resulted in costly losses, and the Luftwaffe eventually became so degraded they could no longer really support any German forces. After getting off the back foot from the rapid German advances, the UK was ready to show what they could do. For a period, both the UK and Germany launched strategic bombing campaigns against civilians. Both countries had to switch to bombing at night due to the high rate of losses during the daytime sorties. This shouldn't come as a huge spoiler, and thus this is somehow the first time you've heard about World War II, but neither bombing campaign in fact induced the other side to surrender, nor resulted in quick victory. The British then shifted and attempted to strike key weapons production sites and industrial centers. They were largely unsuccessful in this too. An internal document called the Butt Report, not joking, shockingly showed that only 1 in 3 strikes was hitting within 5 miles of the intended target. 5 miles. I would like to remind the kind folks of the audience that we are once again looking for an accuracy of 20 meters or less from a target to actually kill someone. So, thus far into the war, the effects of these bomber fleets had been, well, a mixed bag of garbage. At this point, America has been attacked and is going to enter the war. The Japanese had seen how ineffective these bombers were in Europe and thought, must be user error. They launched their own bombing raid against Pearl Harbor in an attempt to knock out the US Pacific Fleet, a bombing run in which the resulting damage was less significant and quicker to repair than the Japanese anticipated. Shocker. In the wake of the attack, the Americans saw these developments in Europe and decided they wanted in on the bomber action too. You see, something of a cult had developed in the US dubbed the Bomber Mafia, not to be confused with the Fighter Mafia, which developed in the later part of the 20th century. No, the Bomber Mafia advocated for a huge fleet of precision bombers to induce capitulation in the enemy. When Lord Stanley Baldwin of the UK said that the bomber will always get through, he was talking about the terror bombing of cities. The Bomber Mafia agreed with Baldwin, but only that the bomber would prevail in its mission, not in what the mission should actually be. The Americans had seen the horrible accuracy and the poor results of the strategic bombing campaigns against civilians, and they decided to take a different approach. The top brass devised a strategy of pinpoint bombing that targeted the enemy economy and the production of weapons. Just like every other nation in this fight, the Yanks wanted a strategy to win the war quickly with minimal casualties. They intended the mission to be against military and industrial targets. These US planners were working off something called industrial web theory. The theory is that through precision bombing, you can destroy key pieces of the enemy's command, logistics, and industry and win the war quickly. They intended the mission to be against military and industrial targets, not the population centers. The top brass thought this would be so effective and unstoppable that they advocated for only heavy bombers and claimed that any other Air Corps expenditures, such as for smaller tactical bombers or fighter aircraft, would just take away from the larger proposed fleet. Why would you need silly things like fighters and stealth bombers when you have a B-17 Flying Fortress? It's a fortress, for God's sake. What could stop that? So, the US goes into Europe with their unstoppable heavy bombers, and they take a few losses. The boys lose nearly 5,000 B-17s throughout the war. The Yanks had initially favored a daytime precision bombing campaign, but much like the British and the Germans, the problems quickly became apparent. Raids over Europe commonly took place in conditions of very poor visibility, with targets partially or wholly obscured by thick cloud or smoke screens from the previous bombing campaigns. As a result, the bomb loads were regularly dropped blind using guesstimation. In addition, only the leading bomber in the formation actually utilized the limited bomb sights that the Americans had developed, and the rest of the formation just dropped their bombs when they saw the lead aircraft's bomb load drop. Since even a very tight bomber formation could cover a vast area, the scatter of bombs was likely to be considerable. Add to these difficulties the disruptive effects of increasingly accurate anti-aircraft flak fire and head-on attacks from fighter aircraft, the theoretical accuracy of daylight bombing was often hard to achieve. Accuracy described as pinpoint never exceeded the best British averages of about 3 miles from any target. Oh dear. Even with the Americans switching the theater from terror bombing campaigns to more military-oriented targets, the pre-war theory of bombing seemed to have been another case of a theory that sounded good on paper but could not hold up. Effects on morale in most cases had been minimal or counterproductive, no civilians had risen up against their governments, and the German war production rose in every year of the war despite the massive air raids. There's a relatively famous instance of the US throwing nearly 300 aircraft in a raid on a ball bearing facility in Schweinfurt, Germany, having identified ball bearings as a supposed bottleneck to all kinds of war production. Although the Schweinfurt factories were badly hit, the mission failed to achieve any lasting effect. The production of the ball bearings in the factory was halted for only 6 weeks, and German war industry could easily rely on its substantial inventory of ball bearings as well as large production surplus. In addition, the ball bearing facilities were dispersed to reduce their bombing risk. Despite the claims from certain American generals that the losses were inconsequential, after this, unescorted daylight bombing raids deep into Germany were suspended until late into the war. Such high losses of air crews could simply not be sustained, and the USAAF recognized the vulnerability of heavy bombers. They then went back to the drawing board and worked on procuring some more fighters to escort the bombers. The Allies finally found moderate success in the last year of the war by targeting German oil production. This drop in oil production is often flaunted as a major success in strategic bombing. I don't necessarily disagree. The German top brass reported that this had a large effect on the overall war effort. However, even these raids on oil production were costly and showed how effective people can be at repairing industry if they are motivated. One of Germany's largest oil facilities for the war in Leuna needed to be hit over 7 times over the course of 2 months to drop it to just 53% capacity. The lesson here is that bombing can have an effect on production, but persistence and precision is the key. Contrary to interwar thinking, the cumulative work of all the bombing campaigns in Europe was arguably negligible on the actual outcome of the war. Now, sources vary on that point a bit. Some people claim that German war production rose, but would have risen by much more if there was no bombing campaign. However, this discussion misses the point that regardless of whether there was some moderate effect or no effect, The air war cost the UK and the US both thousands of aircraft and certainly did not result in a weeks-long quick victory for any of the parties involved. The close air support missions the Allies did end up flying proved somewhat effective, but yet again costly and hard to coordinate. Instances of friendly fire were certainly not low. After this experience and armed with new weapons, the US top brass took these lessons into the Pacific theater. The industrial targets had failed, and after years of war, the US was ready to pivot to a more total war approach. The firebombings of Tokyo killed over 100,000 people, with millions of homes going up in the blaze. This, combined with America's recent mastery of the atom, led Japan to surrender. This conclusion to the Second World War arguably gives strategic bombing against a civilian population one of its only major successes in history. The Japanese emperor commented to his nation, "Should we continue to fight, not only will it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization." However, it should be noted that the Japanese people did not in fact surrender. Facing a threat of extinction, the Japanese government surrendered. Surveys of Japan indicate that the people would have continued to fight on, even given the nuclear strikes. Turns out, people aren't often inclined to give in to coercion, even if the situation is nuclear. Nuclear weapons, in fact, don't do much to change human nature. Okay, so the initial bombing campaigns did not go the best, but aircraft were a relatively new technology and people were still learning how to use them effectively. So, armed with this knowledge, the US opted to keep things rolling immediately in Korea. The way that World War II had escalated from Germany's annexations was fresh in the people's minds, and South Korea, being at risk of being lost, paved the way for yet another massive US bombing campaign. In the air, the United States faced little opposition, and by the end of the war had destroyed an estimated 85% of all the buildings in North Korea? Jesus. This campaign began with only military targets, although the accuracy was still abysmal, so damage to other structures was high. As the war dragged on, the targeting expanded to civilian structures. 3 years in, Dean Rusk, the U.S. State Department official who headed East Asian affairs, concluded that America had bombed everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another. So, what was the North Korean response to this? They instructed their civilians to build dugouts and mud huts to solve the housing problem. The U.S. bombing campaign had to eventually be halted due to, I shit you not, lack of targets. This campaign did not result in the surrender of North Korea, shocker, despite having control of the airspace. The US lost nearly 3,000 aircraft in this operation, with much of the blame being put on Chinese and Soviet interceptor aircraft coming to aid the Koreans. America was more effective in their close air support missions, which only comprised 15% of all missions flown. In those sorties, close air support was credited with inflicting equal enemy casualties as ground assets while destroying nearly 3/4 of DPRK mobile equipment and artillery. Likewise, during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, close air support is credited for nearly 50% of ground casualties. Once again, the air campaign had proved effective in supporting ground forces, but not breaking the will of the enemy people. So, armed with this knowledge, the United States saw a similar situation to Korea arising in Southeast Asia, and this set the stage for, of course, yet another massive US bombing campaign. The United States deemed that the problem in Korea was clearly that they didn't do enough bombing. The US would go on to drop nearly 3 times the tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam as they did in all theaters of World War II. The Yanks would name these air campaigns outstanding things, such as Operation Barrel Roll, Operation Steel Tiger, Operation Tiger Hound, Operation Menu, Operation Lawnmower, Operation Patio, Operation Linebacker, and Operation Linebacker 2. I only made up one of those. By this time, the US had obviously solved all the problems with its previous air campaigns and everything went swimmingly. US Air Command achieved a quick victory and we all danced in the streets. Wait, hang on. I'm being informed that is not what happened in the Vietnam War. Okay, so the US gets into a nearly decade-long campaign which resulted in the loss of... Holy shit, is that right? 10,000 aircraft? Jesus Christ, no wonder this war was unpopular. Fuck. Now to prove I'm just not exclusively clowning on the US, I will briefly note 2 other air campaigns in this period not by people called the United States. The Soviet Union thought Vietnam looked so fun they decided to do their own version in Afghanistan. Although the air campaign wasn't nearly as extensive as the Soviets didn't have the capability to execute one on the scale that the US did. Regardless, the campaign did not result in victory and the Soviets lost 500 aircraft. The USSR used their air force in a variety of ways, but would notably level entire villages to deny the Mujahideen refuge. People also cite this war as a large reason the Soviet Union broke apart. So overall, I would call that campaign also a complete and utter failure. Beyond the Soviet invasion, I would be leaving out critical information if I didn't at least mention the Iran-Iraq War. Now, if you haven't read anything on this war, it is truly fascinating and I would encourage you to do so. But for our purposes, all you need to know is that Iran used to be a US ally, but they had a revolution. Iraq didn't like Iran due to being neighbors and historic rivals. Conflict broke out in 1980 and lasted for 8 years. The conflict went back and forth, but was largely a stalemate. 4 years in, Saddam Hussein looked for something to turn the tide. Obviously, being a student of history, Saddam figured that strategic bombing of civilians would probably do the trick. In what has been dubbed the War of the Cities, Saddam launched conventional and chemical raids on Iranian civilians. Iran responded by immediately surrendering, and Iraq went on to rule the entire Middle East. Wait, sorry, I'm hearing again that shockingly did not happen. Iran responded with their own targeting of Iraqi cities and continued fighting for 4 more years. The Iraqi raids were expensive and were really only able to be maintained because Iraq was being supported by powerful allies like the USA and the Soviets. They simply had more aircraft to spare than Iran did. Now, I would be lying if I claimed this strategic bombing campaign against Iran had no effect. By 1998, Iran's air force had been severely degraded because they had been operating on American aircraft that they were no longer being supplied with replacement parts for. The fear of an all-out chemical attack against Iran's now largely unprotected civilian population weighed heavily on the Iranian leadership, and they realized that the international community had no intentions of restraining Iraq. The lives of the civilian population of Iran were becoming very disrupted, with 1/3 of the urban population evacuating major cities in fear of a seemingly imminent chemical war. Meanwhile, Iraqi conventional bombs and missiles continuously hit towns and cities, destroying the vital civilian and military infrastructure. Iran replied with missile and air attacks, but not sufficiently to deter the Iraqis. Saddam sent a warning to the Iranians in mid-1988, threatening to launch a new and powerful full-scale invasion and attack Iranian cities with weapons of mass destruction. Shortly afterward, Iraqi aircraft bombed an Iranian town with poison gas. This weighed into Iran's decision to sign a ceasefire. However, notice I said ceasefire and not surrender. The Iran-Iraq War had no clear winner, and neither country got much out of it. Iraq ended up with a huge military of over 5,000 tanks and 1,000 fixed-wing aircraft. They now had the 4th largest military in the world, although they were left with a major debt from the long war. Now, at this point, some of the people were beginning to talk. The American public is stupid, but not that stupid. It became obvious that after multiple expensive and protracted campaigns, the top brass might not be coming up with the most effective solutions. For those of you who are not from America, we have a saying here in Tennessee. Well, I know we have it in Texas, but probably in Tennessee too. It goes,
Fool me once. Shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Unfortunately, when leadership is making bad decisions, people are often left with an information void. This can lead the public to put their faith in, well, grifters. During this period, the fighter mafia sprung up, led by one Pierre Spray, an infamous group of ass clowns who capitalized on America's poor performance in the air to push their own dumb agenda. This circus pushed the narrative, citing the US losing to poor maneuverability of their jets and over-reliance on technology. Narratives that ignored the fact that most of the US planes were in fact lost overwhelmingly to traditional anti-aircraft flak fire. For example, of the 370 Air Force F-4 Phantom fighter bombers that were lost, 307 of those were lost to traditional flak fire. Only 33 were lost to interceptor aircraft. This ratio of nearly 10-to-1 losses of intercepted aircraft versus aircraft lost to traditional anti-aircraft fire was the same for almost every other category of bomber and fighter. The fighter mafia and others who shit on the US military are not interested in facts, though. These are people interested in pitching simple explanations to complex problems. When someone comes up to you and says, "The government is completely stupid and corrupt, and I can fix it with my own simple idea," the alarm bells should be going off in your head. Some might argue, in fact, that the problem the top brass had for a long time was that they were, in fact, operating with tactics and machines that were not advanced enough to achieve the desired result. Turns out winning a war isn't as simple as building a shit ton of heavy bombers. Similarly, the fighter mafia proposing that the US should churn out a bunch of simple dogfighting planes with a gun and no other features is equally dumb. War is complicated and hard to do well. If you're not convinced that these guys are morons yet, just know that before his very timely death, Pierre Spray's favorite pastime was going on Russia Today and shitting on the US military for money. That being said, just because many of the critics are grifters, it doesn't mean there isn't a problem. After Vietnam, the US military was definitely on the hot seat. The beliefs of Duhay, Trenchard, and the other interwar planners were over 50 years in the rearview mirror, and reality had begun to set in. US Air Command took some time off and chilled a little. They knew they still needed to fulfill their role of world power, but no more interventions involving thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of ground troops would be imminent. It is no coincidence that 4 years after Vietnam, Star Wars would come out. And for those of you who haven't seen Star Wars, actually, you know what? If you haven't seen Star Wars, go watch it right now. It is more important than this video. But it's important to note that in that movie, we get a space-themed trench run. By this point in history, we have moved on from the belief that you can hit a building from a moving plane with a bomb to a depiction of a bombing run where our protagonist can't even hit his target with a computer and needs to rely on space magic. With the US apparently taking a step back from being so hawkish on foreign policy, other world leaders began to notice. One of those world leaders we have already talked about. Saddam was fresh off his long fight with Iran and his economy was tanked. Faced with the complex problem of managing a petrostate economy as well as demobilizing his army without causing a rise in militant groups, he opted for a simple solution. Don't demobilize the army, just blame Kuwait and take their oil.
Go sell some medicine, bitches! Trying to get that oil!
So Saddam took his army and rolled over the small nation to his south. Unfortunately for Saddam, the US was allied with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and did not like this. Actually, a lot of people in the UN didn't like this. As well as being seen as morally wrong by most nations, the annexation of Kuwait would put Saddam Hussein in direct control of too much of the world's oil supply for most people to be comfortable with. 4.3 million barrels per day to be exact. Although I don't think this was the primary reason for intervention, there is clearly a political incentive to stop shocks from global energy markets from happening. This was also seen as a threat to other US allies in the Middle East, like the aforementioned Saudis and Israel. Troops from around the world poured into Saudi Arabia and prepared for the worst. The UN issued a resolution to Saddam that he must withdraw. He responded by digging massive fortifications along the border of Kuwait and committing atrocities against the people of Kuwait. These extensive fortifications along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border would be dubbed the Saddam Line and were described as impenetrable. Well, the coalition was about to penetrate it with everything they had. Coming out of a period of no major conflicts and with a memory of losing to a small nation in Southeast Asia still fresh in the American mind, the public response to Bush saying,
"This will not be another Vietnam,"
was, well,
You serious?
Facing the million-man Iraqi army, critics predicted a years-long slugfest. I have it on good authority that even the US Navy expected to lose half of its aircraft in the theater. Fortunately, the top brass had been in the lab and had something special in store for us.
Look at this lion. He's the king of the jungle. Huge mane out there. He's laying down under a tree in the middle of Africa. He's so big. He's so hot. He doesn't want to move. Now, the little lion cubs, they start messing with him. Biting his tail, biting his ears. He doesn't do anything. Now, the other animals, they notice this. And they start to move in. The jackals. Hyenas. They're barking at him, laughing at him. They nip his toes and eat the food that's in his domain. They do this, and they get closer and closer and bolder, till one day, that lion gets up and tears the shit out of everybody.
Countries with forces in the Gulf area have exhausted all reasonable efforts to reach a peaceful resolution, have no choice but to drive Saddam from Kuwait by force. We will not fail. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Come on!
Holy fucking shit.
Operation Desert Storm is without a doubt the most successful military campaign in modern history. The ground campaign lasted for just 100 hours and ended in absolute rout in favor of the coalition forces. One of the primary factors in the speed and decisiveness of this victory was the massive air campaign carried out by mainly the US. This coalition had done something that hadn't been seen since Germany defeated France 50 years earlier, an absolute dismantling of a well-equipped military in a matter of weeks, resulting in very few casualties to the attacker.
Excuse me.
High blood!
It's not possible.
Not probable.
Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how the fuck did they do that? A very valid question. Let us dive into the critical factors for success of this air campaign. The following information is derived from a variety of publicly available sources. I lean heavily on the Gulf Air Power Summary Report, which was written in 1993, and the Lessons of Modern War, Volume 4, Chapter 7. I also had the pleasure of talking to a U.S. Navy strike lead with a master's degree in exactly this topic. My main question to answer was, why did this campaign work while basically all those before it had failed? The plan was to be executed in 3 phases. Step 1 was to gain control of the airspace. Iraqi air defense sites, radar installations, SAM sites, and airstrips were hit first. Step 2 was to disrupt Iraqi command and control as well as troop and supply movements. Step 3 was to attrit ground forces, then provide close air support to the ground campaign. This plan is notably achievable and not based on unproven theories of civilian morale. However, when talking to real pilots, it becomes apparent that the actual tactics used were not the most important factor. The real decisive factors were something I have dubbed the basics. Number 1, and most importantly, the aircraft they were using more or less worked. I have been avoiding this topic, but the aircraft of the Vietnam era and before were essentially junk. They simply didn't work at a high enough rate to ever achieve their goals. Even the F-14, which was a new plane during Vietnam, was notorious for simply not working. Hell, the Navy F-14 guys had a term for this called flying an iron bird. This means an aircraft that is flying, but all the electronics, radar, and weapon systems are offline. Once again, this was common enough for the pilots to have an actual name for the phenomenon. Now, I know I probably just called your favorite plane of all time junk, but it's just the truth. The World War II and early Cold War era equipment didn't really work well for anyone. The Soviets reported in World War II that they often lost equal numbers of tanks to mechanical breakdowns as an actual battle. Keep in mind they were losing thousands of tanks in actual battle. The US equipment was better, but not that much better. By Desert Storm, all these problems were being addressed. This operation shows that having working equipment is possible, it's simply very, very hard. I have it on good authority that a Navy squadron of 8 aircraft went into the theater with 160 maintenance personnel for just those 8 aircraft. Having aircraft that work isn't just hard, it is a Herculean task that requires an unparalleled focus on maintenance and logistics. For an aircraft that lands on a carrier, we're talking a required maintenance time of 10 to 20 times longer than the time the plane actually flies. Yes, that is 20 or 30 maintenance hours per flight hour. You might be thinking, doesn't this prove the point the reformers made that the US aircraft are too complex? No. The plane's breaking is not a matter of complexity, but a matter of planes being really complex machines to start with. The way military procurement works is the Air Force or Navy puts out a request for a plane that can do X thing, carry X amount of bombs, or fly so fast. The US military-industrial complex then finds a way to build it. It turns out getting machines that can actually do what the military wants them to do is really hard. Combine that with whatever technology you put in the plane having to deal with massive G-forces and the problem becomes apparent. Any way you slice it, a modern plane needs some kind of computer and advanced technology in it. But a war zone is no place for a computer. On an aircraft carrier, even a standard landing is extremely rough. Carriers don't have especially long runways, and landings on the deck are painful. The way it's been described to me is, imagine you were tasked with making sure an iPad worked, but every time someone used it, they Gronk spiked it into the pavement. It would be possible to maintain the device and fix it between uses, but it wouldn't be easy. I cannot emphasize enough that there really isn't a way around this maintenance and logistics problem. Equipment in war zones gets damaged and you absolutely need to fix and maintain it. The other factor that goes hand in hand with aircraft that actually work is ability to actually hit a target. By this time, precision-guided weapons had been perfected. Although less than 10% of munitions used were considered precise, these weapons proved very effective. Additionally, munitions not considered precise had improved too. Anti-radiation missiles were so effective that Iraqi positions eventually stopped even turning their targeting radars on. Key factor number 2, speed. America had seen the effectiveness of surface-to-air missiles as well as anti-tank guided missiles during Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War, and the Yom Kippur War. This led US planners to rethink some of their doctrine. The task was to be able to defend Europe from a Soviet invasion using conventional forces. The USA and allies needed to figure out a way to inflict asymmetric losses onto a much larger Soviet tank and armored vehicle fleet. The solution they came up with was something called air-land battle. This doctrine emphasized close coordination between land and air forces, acting aggressively as a maneuvering force. The idea was to disrupt enemy logistics and create local man and firepower advantages. By this point, the US knew that people tend to repair infrastructure and find alternate ways of logistics and communication quickly. So, the emphasis was put on timing windows. Different parts of the military leadership would be concerned with the state of the battlefield at different times. For example, if a bridge or supply route is hit, this begins an imaginary clock, where the ground forces may gain a numbers or firepower advantage in that area. The same can be said for electronic warfare. It was no longer assumed that jamming or destruction of radar would permanently knock them out. Instead, tight timing windows were established for airstrikes, with some of them being as tight as 10 seconds between the times aircraft were supposed to be in the same location. Although stealth aircraft were used, one of the main reasons so few aircraft were lost here was paradoxically that the US flew so many sorties in such a short time. The highest number of airstrikes per day in Vietnam was in the hundreds of sorties. This time, the top brass had scaled this up to the thousands of sorties per day. Almost all these missions were accompanied by at least one aircraft capable of electronic warfare. At times, the amount of electronic jamming happening in the theater was so intense that aircraft would see light shows coming off the tips of their wings, resembling the Aurora Borealis.
Aurora Borealis! At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within your kitchen.
Yes.
This emphasis on speed and maneuverability applied to all coalition forces. The aviators I've talked to report being shocked at the speed at which they saw tanks and armored vehicles moving across the desert. The theory being a tank, plane, or helicopter is much harder to destroy if it's moving at top speed. Key factor number 3 was realistic objectives and planning. It should not be ignored that George Bush, the US president at the time, was an aviator in Vietnam. The rest of the US top brass were also Vietnam-era soldiers. They knew exactly what their forces were capable of doing and would not make the mistake of choosing an impossible mission. The strategy in Vietnam had been one of gradual escalation to apply political pressure. They were not going to go down that path. This was not a campaign against a political movement or an insurgent force. Removing Saddam from power was not a goal, and the fight was determined to be against the conventional military of Iraq. The United States had just gotten out of a massive arms buildup preparing to defend Europe from the Soviets. Iraq was a military operating mostly Soviet equipment. The overall point here is if you build a military for a task, then ask it to do an easier version of that task, it will probably succeed. The Germans were successful in France during World War II because that was the entire basis of their state and their army. They then struggled to do anything past those goals for which they had built their army to achieve. The actual tactics of the ground campaign were relatively simple. Pin down the Iraqi forces in the theater. Then, once their communication and movement was disrupted, coalition forces conducted a massive flanking maneuver to surround and destroy the Republican Guard. Not really rocket science. Now, I know there are several people losing their shit as they listen to this thinking, The only reason the coalition forces had success was that the Iraqi military was incompetent. I will concede this point a little. I cannot in good faith sit here and tell you that the military of Iraq was well run. This was a force led by a dictator who had more incentive to promote loyalists than competent soldiers. Additionally, there are a myriad of cultural factors that have prevented the militaries of the Middle East from performing well over the past several hundred years. I could go on for hours about why the Middle Eastern militaries have not performed well, but I don't really have time to get into it right now. While these are all factors, the people of the Iraqi military were still human beings, and human beings have more in common with each other than they don't. I would just like to highlight some things mentioned by analysts that do not deviate from previous air campaigns. Desert Storm did include some elements of strategic bombing, albeit less. For our purposes, most of the campaign would go into either tactical or close air support category. This isn't because the Air Force didn't want to execute a larger strategic bombing campaign. However, the top brass needed to be restrained and refocused on the task at hand. The tactical strikes and minor strategic bombing that did occur had pretty much the same effect as all the campaigns that came before it. The Iraqis repaired almost everything quicker than expected and found alternate ways to communicate and move supplies faster than expected. Shocker. Aircraft continued to be lost primarily to ground-based anti-aircraft flak fire more than interceptor aircraft or SAM sites. The US had initially favored attack runs flying low and under the radar. After it was clear that the Iraqi Air Force and SAM sites were significantly attrited, these missions were shifted to be high-altitude sorties to stay out of range of the anti-aircraft fire. Additionally, these infrastructure targets often proved more resilient to attack than expected. In one instance, the US Navy threw nearly 20 sorties of conventional and precision-guided weapons at a bridge and failed to bring it down. Now, for anyone who isn't a civil engineer, the entire design of a bridge is meant to take force and distribute it throughout the structure and disperse it into the ground. Destroying one isn't as easy as just hitting it with a few bombs or missiles. Just a side note, this is one of the reasons it doesn't surprise me that the Kerch Strait Bridge is still standing despite several Ukrainian attacks. The US Army also went after Iraqi oil production sites looking to replicate the success they had against the Germans in World War II. Unfortunately, the campaign wasn't really long enough for this to actually have an effect, as hitting oil production is only going to have an effect months or years in the future. Additionally, the Iraqis had a huge spare refining capacity, and it would be extremely difficult to knock it all out. They also were occupying Kuwait, which had their own refining capacity. And finally, the Iraqi army really wasn't moving much as they were on the defensive. So, cutting off their oil would have questionable results even if it was achieved. The point I'm trying to make here is just because the target sets were more accurate, it doesn't mean that they were perfect. The power struggle between the Army and Air Force also continued. The A-10 has received much criticism as a close air support plane. This is for good reason. It is a plane that has to fly low and slow to use its primary weapon, a huge rotary cannon. This aircraft is pretty much vulnerable to everything and is notorious for inflicting friendly fire. However, the problem still existed that the Air Force often refused to fly close air support when needed. The thing about close air support is the missions are often time sensitive and the situation might not be ideal for a plane to fly into. If you have never met anyone in the US Air Force, the culture there is that they're a bunch of genius techno geeks. These guys love their fancy equipment and hate losing it. The other thing about pilots is you cannot force them to fly somewhere they don't want to fly. Not that any aviators would do this, but it's pretty easy to see a bad situation and cite mechanical problems or some other reason you can't do the mission. Point being, if the Air Force doesn't want to use its fancy aircraft in close air support, they won't. Now, to be completely fair to any pilots out there, yes, close air support definitely does suck to do. People on the ground being shot at are often terrible sources of information. In the 1990s, GPS had been invented, but its precision was abysmal and battery technology was so bad that these trackers rarely worked. So, if someone on the ground asks you to drop unguided bombs to hit people without even being able to describe accurately where they are, you might proceed with caution. The target could be as close as on the other side of a sand dune. Oh, and if you miss, the friendly fire incident will be recorded for all of history. It is understandable then that aviators have often told the army to kick rocks. The message here is that all the previous problems discovered with air campaigns still applied. The top brass was just more prepared and better equipped to handle them. I would also like to note that as late as 1998, the US Marine Corps listed themselves as the inventor of close air support in their own textbooks. This isn't relevant to anything, I just don't know where to include it in the video. Yes, this infamous group of crayon eaters really thought they came up with the idea of using a plane to help the infantry. No, Marine Corps, you did not invent close air support. I don't even know how to get into how stupid the concept that they did come up with it is. You know what, we're like an hour into this video. Hopefully you all know enough about history by now to explain that that idea is dumb. So, what is the point of all this? Well, first I would say history has no point, it just is. Similarly, the history of bombing campaigns has no point. It's neither good nor bad, it just is. But, circling all the way back to my original prompt, do these air campaigns actually work? Well, if you evaluate them on the metrics of the interwar planners, then no. Knowing what we do now, it seems almost impossible to win a war outright through strategic bombing. In fact, the effect seems to usually increase the will of the opposing civilians to resist. It should be said, however, that threats of strategic bombing have sporadically worked. I'm not an expert in airstrikes, but I do have a degree in neuroscience, so I'll explain this phenomenon in the simplest terms possible. If someone threatens to blow up your house unless you pay them $20, you might actually pay that. This is called blackmail, and it does in fact work. Sometimes. Especially if the threat is credible. Now, if a person blows up your house, then asks for $20, they are more likely to see you go through a Batman-style origin story than they are to actually get their money. People tend to get very vindictive very fast when their homes or family members are being messed with. Apply this logic to strategic bombing and you can see why populations have responded how they did. Looking at the history of planes being used in war reminds me a lot of artillery or really any other weapon introduced. The effect is dramatic, but not nearly as dramatic as people anticipated. There really is no such thing as a wonder weapon, but there is such thing as a weapon. And weapons require training, good tactics, and integration with other weapons. Doing these basic things is much harder than anyone would imagine looking at it on a surface level. It is possible for a massive air campaign to be disruptive to logistics, communication, and attrit the enemy forces so badly that the ground campaign goes off without a hitch. But this type of operation isn't simple or easy. The doctrine isn't simple, and the machines involved aren't either. So, when Elon Musk or any other Reddit mod tries to tell you that the future of warfare is mass drone swarms bombing the enemy into oblivion, please look down on those claims with some suspicion. In fact, please look down on any claims that a complex geopolitical problem can be easily solved. This just usually isn't the case. The internet shows you what you want to hear, and simple explanations of things make the viewer feel smart. Just remember that paradoxically, feeling smart is often the inverse of actually being knowledgeable. Since World War II, there has only been one nation that has demonstrated the ability to conduct a military campaign against a large force and truly end a war fast with minimal casualties. Russia has shown they can't. China hasn't fought a war of any scale in generations, and Europe has let their militaries decay to the point they only have forces oriented towards territorial defense. We've seen Iran and Iraq tear each other apart furiously with no effect. But the United States has shown the ability to do something hard to come by: quickly and decisively eject an invading power from an ally's territory. Thank you.
Now watch this drive. All right, you need another.